So you've built the budget decks, you're looking for ways to improve them, and in today's video we'll be diving into some budget decks I've already covered on the channel. I'm unsure if these are all from the same video, but these are all pretty newer budget decks I created here on my MTG Arena deck list. A couple of these are ones that people have been asking for on how to go about upgrading them. I just figured I'd go over a couple others, just kind of fill up and give you guys a variety of deck list I went ahead and improved to kind of give you an overall better idea how to go and figure out how to improve them, maybe better to get you into the higher ranks or just have a more enjoyable play style, because sometimes budget decks can be very limited. With that being said, I am Scar TV. Welcome to the channel, and like I said, in today's video we go into some budget decks I previously created and go over how I upgraded them to make them probably a little bit better with the new cards I added into them. That being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into the deck list and let's talk about them. Now, this first deck list that we have here is my Boros Summoning or Dragon's Approach, whatever you want to call it. Essentially, the goal here is we're playing a card in the deck called Dragon's Approach. It deals 3 damage to each opponent. You may exile Dragon's Approach and 4 cards named Dragon's Approach from your graveyard. If you do, search your library for a dragon card creature, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. A deck may have any number of these cards named Dragon's Approach in them. So essentially, the goal here is we play a bunch of copies of this particular card. And the goal is we're trying to do what we can to kind of throw them in the graveyard to allow us to be able to essentially get out a free Lorehold Dragon for cheaper than normally we would actually have to pay. So if we draw the right cards, we could possibly get this guy out on turn 4, turn 5, depending on how well you draw, and as long as you can hit the right amount of mana. I think that if you can get to at least 3 mana, you're usually pretty good. It does get kind of weird and clunky if you haven't played the deck previously or this is your first time seeing this deck list. Just because if you draw this card, it kind of gives you fewer opportunities or fewer dragons that you can actually search for. So in the upgraded version, we kind of do a couple different things to the deck to kind of make it a little bit easier to help fix that problem. With that being said, nothing really too much has changed about the deck. I actually added in really just a couple of things just to kind of fine-tune the deck just a little bit to make it that much better. One of the cards I added in the deck, I only added 2 copies of, but I added in the deck to kind of help get Lorehold Dragon back into the deck, is being Valakut Awakening. If you haven't seen this card, it's from Zendikar Rising. It is a modal card, so it can become a land that comes into battlefield tap, or we can cast it. Essentially, it is pay any number of cards from our hand on the bottom of our library, and then draw that many cards plus 1. So essentially what we can do here in this situation is we can get rid of things like if we draw way too many lands, we can put lands on the bottom of our deck. We can put our Lorehold Dragon back into our deck if we do draw him early before we can get off with the Dragon's Approach. So essentially that card is in here. We can do it at instant speed, so we can wait and kind of see what our opponent does, kind of maybe cycle some of our cards from our hand back into the deck and kind of, draw it before we go for the following turn. The other card I added into the deck, because I do think it actually helps because we have a lot of things that we're dumping into the graveyard, is we actually added an Ox of Agonis. So essentially here we can play it for its 5 mana to be a 4/2, but we can also, if it gets this card in put into the graveyard, we can pay its escape cost, which is 2 red mana. Then we exile 8 other cards from the graveyard, and it escapes with a +1/+1 counter on it. But essentially the idea here is that when he enters the battlefield, we actually discard our hand. So if we have a bunch of Dragon's Approaches and stuff like that, and then we draw 3 cards, goal here is it just kind of refills itself and helps us fill up our graveyard in a way. Nothing really changed in our discard/draw spells in the original deck list. Still got 4 copies of Cathartic Reunion, so we can discard 2 cards, draw 3 cards, throw a Possibility, discard a card, draw 2 cards at instant speed, which is very good, and throw Discovery, which essentially is just like the previous ones, but we gain 2 life, and then we can discard 2 cards and then draw 3 cards. So all of this is kind of like our discard to kind of get these into the graveyard. Where are they? Into the graveyard without actually casting them, and then when we want to actually have the combo go off, or essentially the trigger go off, to essentially exile 4 other copies of this card plus this one, search our library for our dragon card, put it onto the battlefield, and then essentially attack and hit our opponent in the face. And as long as our opponent doesn't have any sort of removal, you essentially do 3 damage plus the 5 damage, and then his ability is whenever he attacks, we look at the top 7 cards of our library, then we may cast an instant or sorcery card with mana value less than or equal to his power without paying his mana cost, and put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. So essentially you are more than likely going to hit another one of these, and you'll be doing a total of 11 damage in one full swing. Other than that, that's really how the deck works. Unfortunately, there's not really much in the deck to kind of protect it. You could add in some of those cards that kind of give your cards hexproof or protection from particular color if that's what if you feel like you're running into a lot of removal. But the goal here is to kind of just go combo off and kind of catch your opponent off guard by just discarding a lot of cards and then just getting out Lorehold Dragon early. Worst case scenario, you draw him and you don't draw enough dragon to purchase throughout the thing. We do have 17 copies, which I do feel like is enough to get this combo to go off pretty consistently. There are cards in the sideboard in my listing here, but I think my listing that will be in the description below is just going to be this 60 card deck. These were cards that I think I was messing around with. If you guys want to mess around with, I do have them in the original budget deck list, but these are definitely cards you can think about adding into the deck. It's just different things like Tormented Voice is essentially just like Throw a Possibility, but at sorcery speed. Merchant of the Veil is actually pretty interesting because he has the Adventure side, which is a 1 red mana. You can discard a card, and if you do, you draw a card and become a creature that you can tap 3 and discard a card and draw a card. So another way that you can kind of, get a discard draw effect. And then essentially gives you a turn 1 play, which is decent. But yet again, you would cut down probably one of your other discard spells. See the Spoils, yet again, another card where you discard a card, draw 2 cards. But you do create a treasure if you need that extra mana or want to ramp. Like I said, Valakut Awakening is kind of in here because, like I said, it was copied from my original budget deck. You can add the Snarl lands if you want. I do think, this deck is mostly red, so it's really just more so splashing the white just to hopefully draw white. So I'll be quite honest, you can add more Snarls if you feel like you're not drawing the white when you need it, but really all we have the white for is Throne Discovery and the Lorehold Dragon. So if you want more white, you can always add in copies of that. And then Illuminating History is yet again another one of those weird things we could add it to the deck. We don't really play anything that has lessons or learn. And then, essentially discard any number of cards, draw that many cards, and then if there are 7 or more cards in our graveyard, we create a 3/2 red-white spirit token. So it's actually not terrible for what our deck does. Our deck is filling up our graveyard full of cards. There are many times where you'll have like 15, 20 cards in your graveyard, which you can get an Ox out and not really affect any of your Dragon's Approaches that are in graveyard. So you could definitely hit that 7 and get a 3/2 token out of it if you feel like you're not getting enough threats. But with that being said, I mean, the deck is interesting. It is kind of one of those, if your opponent disrupts your combo, essentially, it does feel kind of clunky because, yet again, we're just trying to get Lorehold out for cheap without paying its full mana costs. That being said, let's go on to the next deck and let's talk about it. So this next deck up on the list is one that you've probably seen kind of going around in a way. And essentially, it's mono white spells or mono white just in general. It's nothing really too crazy. I would say it's also could be considered like mono white weenie, but essentially the goal here is we're playing a lot of spells / creatures in the deck. I would say the breakdown is probably 50-50 for the most part, almost. So yeah, we have 21 creatures, 15 spells, 4 sorceries. So we're about 50-50 when it comes to everything. But the idea here with the deck is we're trying to play creatures besides Ulti's Life Bounty that have Magecraft, and then whenever we cast a copy or instant or sorcery spell, it gets +2/+2 and end of turn. I think we have Leonine Lightscribe that gives +1/+1 to all creatures we control as well, which is one of the cards we actually upgrade into. Another card we actually added in here, just kind of like because the idea of what the meta currently is. I do think this is actually a pretty interesting card to add into the deck to kind of disrupt some of these coming into the battlefield triggers, or when things trigger when they enter the battlefield, make your opponent attack some. I mean, this is something you probably could put in the sideboard if you do play best of 3 Magic, but it's something I'm messing around with, and I've kind of had some success with it, taxing your opponent's things, especially like rogues and stuff like that, making them having to pay that additional 2 mana, like when their 1 rogue comes into the battlefield, or even things that come out with Sultai Ultimatum, you then tax those things. So whenever it's whenever a permanent, it's not just creatures, it's whenever a permanent trigger enter the battlefield, Trials is a triggered ability trigger, counter unless that controller pays 2. So it's just an overall just tax, which is definitely something your opponent's not expecting, and it's definitely interesting to kind of see how it plays out. I do think this is one of those things, if there's a lot of decks that have a lot of value when there's a lot of things that enter the battlefield and trigger something, this could be one of those cards that kind of slows them down or disrupts that whole thing. But other than that, I mean, the deck is pretty straightforward. We are playing Clarion Spirit as well to help pump out creature tokens, because when we cast our second spell each turn, you get a 1/1 white spirit token, just to kind of overwhelm our opponent. We also have Mavinda in the deck. Essentially, Mavinda was in my first deck, but it is a legendary bird advisor and has flying for 0 mana. You may cast an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard this turn. If that spell doesn't target creature control, it costs 8 more to cast this way. If that spell, we put it in the graveyard, exile it instead. So essentially, all of these, pump spells or whatever spells we have in our deck, whenever we cast them, we can always pay 0 and just play them again to essentially get that second trigger for Clarion Spirit, or just trigger them on a turn where maybe we don't have a spell to cast. But the idea here is we're just trying to pump up, trigger Clever, Cleaver, whatever it is, Get some show confidences, which essentially gives copies and gives target creature +1/+1 counter, gains vigilance end of turn. Just a lot of ways to just kind of pump our creatures, make them stronger. Another card I kind of was thinking about adding and making this Boros instead of was that just added in the one dragon that whenever it attacks, create a treasure token, and that produces 2 mana, and then whenever you target with a spell, you create a treasure. Whenever it gets targeted with a spell, you create a treasure token, which is interesting, but I don't know if it's really worth it. I am playing Make Your Mark, which is a red-white splash spell. This is kind of one of those spells that I'm kind of like tweaking with just because it's interesting. Because the idea here is whenever target creature gets +1/+0 into end of turn, when that creature dies this turn, create a 3/2 red-white spirit token. So essentially my idea here is just in case if we want to get really aggressive and go for some blocks or go for some attacks, we can swing in aggressively. If our opponent decides to kill something, maybe we can pump our creature with +1/+0 and then in turn get a 3/2 out of it, which is kind of like an interesting kind of combat trick in case that's something. Yet again, I don't really know how I feel about it. I've played a very limited amount of games with it where I've actually drawn it to actually cast it. But yet again, it's one of those things I kind of overlooked the first time I made the deck, so I figured I'd test it out in this version. And then we do have a lesson board. I didn't actually add the academic probation into the main board or the main lesson board. You can always add it. Essentially, it's like a way to kind of like stall our opponent from really casting their big spells. And then, until your next turn, it can't attack and can't block. So essentially, we have 2 ways. We can just prevent them from casting their one big spell, or we can make target not only permanent, not be able to block and or attack. So each their own, depending on what side you want. So you can definitely add a couple copies of that. Maybe get rid of Introduction to Annihilation. Maybe get rid of 1 Expanded Anatomy and have 2 copies of this. It depends. Lesson board is always, whatever you feel. Expanded Anatomy is really good for the deck, giving our creatures +1/+2 +1/+1 counters, and Vigilance is very good because we can attack it very aggressively, not having to tap things down. Also putting them on something like a Clever Lumancer, giving it +2/+2, +2 more +1/+1 counters, and Vigilance. The thing becomes pretty beefy and pretty tanky pretty quickly. So definitely a pretty interesting thing, and just being able to recur any of our spells with our Mavinda just makes him that much better. So just a very interesting deck, a very aggressive deck. You want to just start swinging aggressively, having, leave a mana open to pump, hopefully drawing your Clever Lumancer, hopefully drawing your Light Scribes, just making your board very big, very aggressive, that your opponent just has to kind of either have some sort of complete board wipe, or they're just going to get overwhelmed by all these little tokens. Now this next deck is Dimir Zombies. Essentially, the deck doesn't change too much in what I did with it. I did remove a few copies of a few cards. I removed some cards completely. But other than that, the deck kind of stayed the same. It is playing a lot of snow. It's playing snow mana because of a lot of the zombies came from Kaldheim, so we do have that kind of like snow mechanic to it. Especially Necromancer is kind of like our snow zombie cleric. If a non-token creature opponent die, exile a card with an ice counter instead, and you may cast spells among cards in your exile with ice counters, and when you spend mana from a snow source, those mana any color to cast those spells. So essentially, he is like our 1 key card that allows us to play our opponent's creatures when they do die. So that's why we're playing the snow mana. Also, Nefarious Betrayer King, also our Snow Lord. Our Zombie Lord, I mean, not Snow Lord. We'll give our other zombies +1/+1. We can pay snow mana to return from our 3 snow mana to return from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So definitely a good way to kind of reoccur him out of the graveyard in case, maybe he gets milled or even just dies in the process. Definitely, interesting. He technically costs cheaper out of the graveyard than he does if you actually cast him for his full mana cost. We added an Engraven Lore because we're playing snow mana. It's a very aggressive, like, draw spell. We scry X, where X is the amount of snow that's spent to cast a spell, and then we draw 3 cards at instant speed, which is definitely very good. Scrying 5 cards, if we paid 5 snow mana to then draw 3 cards, we can figure out what we want, get the things we need, depending on the situation, and then just, put the rest on the bottom of the library and just kind of set it and forget it. The other one we added is Blood on the Snow, just kind of board wipe completely. We destroy all creatures, we destroy all planeswalkers, we then return a creature or planeswalker that costs X or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, where X is the amount of snow that was spent to cast a spell. So essentially we can, spend... I think, I don't know if the 2 solid black mana count if we spent black snow mana for that, or if it's, just the colorless mana for the snow, but you can essentially almost return everything in the deck with that snow mana. But yet again, we have another card in the deck that we're kind of messing around with, just a 1 copy of, and in this card is Haunted Voyage. It is a 6 mana sorcery straight up, or we can foretell it for 2 and then later play it for 7. But we choose a creature type and then we turn up to 2 creatures of that type from your graveyard to the battlefield. If that spell was foretold, return all creatures of that type from your graveyard to the battlefield instead. So essentially, if our opponent, wipes us out and it's getting into the later game, this is kind of that way that we can kind of just overwhelm our opponent with just getting everything back from our graveyard, whether it was milled, whether it was destroyed, whether it just, just got sent there because of our own doing. It's just a very interesting way to just kind of overwhelm your opponent with just like, boom, here's all our stuff back. I don't know what you're going to do about it unless you have another board wipe kind of thing. Definitely very interesting there. On top of that, we also have Dimir Calls the Dead. Just milling 3 cards, exile a creature or enchantment. If we do, we get a 2/2 zombie. And then on chapter 3 of it, we get to gain X life and scry X or X's number of zombies control. Our deck is full of zombies, so definitely get a big scry from that and gain a lot of life. So definitely pretty cool there. Added, 4 copies, at 1 up to 4 copies of Murderous Rider just because it is a zombie with lifelink, and also it's a kill spell against our opponent. Other than that, nothing much really changed with the deck. I do think we removed a card. I can't remember which one it was. But I mean, I will have a link for the, I'm sure a card probably popped up while you're watching this that has the previous video that has some of these decks in it throughout while you're watching the video. But overall, this deck is a pretty good, pretty competitive deck that feels pretty cool to play, like Zombie Tribal. I don't know if it's as strong as a lot of the tribal decks that are currently out there, but it's definitely fun to play with zombies and just kind of play with a little bit of snow and kind of mix it in. We do also add pathways. I forgot to mention just a blue-black pathway just to kind of help us filter our mana depending on what we need. We still have 2 ice tunnels. But yet again, we're only really splashing blue if we really need it because it's like the Nefari, Betrayer King, and Graven Lore are really the only sources we need. Everything else is mostly black mana, which we play in the deck. Now, this last deck is a deck that I was requested to kind of do an upgrade video on, and doing so, I actually kind of really enjoy the deck and seeing what it changed into. But essentially, this is our Boros Dwarves deck, and it's pretty interesting in what it does. It's a mostly red heavy deck with a little bit of white splash in for a couple Dwarves, essentially. So it's not really, it could be mono red Dwarves if we really wanted to. But I was just, I kind of had these cards in the deck, and I kind of want to keep them in there. With them being really cool, the Forge Master, creature tokens we control have +1/+1. If they're enchanted or equip, and then Rip Apart is another one that I'm messing around with. I'm kind of like losing favor on it just because it's 2 mana, but it is a sorcery, so it's kind of not as good as I thought it originally was. It does feel a little bit slower, but I do like the idea that it has to choose one depending on the situation: destroy target artifact or enchantment, or target creature or deal 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. We're also playing snow mana in the deck, so we do have Frostbite in here, so we can, in the game it does 2 damage, but once we get that 3rd snow land out or snow permanent, it will deal 3 damage instead, so definitely good there for spot removal. 3 Magdas, just because it's legendary, we could play 4, but I think 3 is good enough. But essentially the way we want to play the deck is essentially play Magda and then hopefully get a Goldspan Dragon, because these are 2 treasure producers in our deck. And the idea here is we can get, this out and start producing treasure tokens, which then makes a lot of our stuff cheaper because we can play it earlier once we start tapping things down and producing additional mana on earlier turns. So on turn 3, you can technically swing with Magda as long as the board's kind of like in their favor to swing in. And if you have any other Dwarves, she comes in late whenever they tap. You create a treasure token. So then you get that free mana, and then you can start, either casting additional spells or saving that up to eventually, sacrificing it, search your library for artifact or dragon card, put on that card into the battlefield, then shuffle. And that kind of actually is pretty interesting here because we get a cool interaction with this. We can get our Goldspan Dragon. We can go search for an Embercleave. We can get a vehicle if we really wanted to, a Bearded Axe, depending on the situation. Just overall pretty interesting. Other than that, nothing really changed. We added in Torbrand to the deck just because why not? Whenever a red source we control would do damage to an opponent or permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2. So essentially makes our Dwarves that much stronger, more aggressive, so our opponent has to really deal with our attackers. We cut down, I think, the Stormkiln Artist to 2 copies because we added in 2 copies of Torbrand. Essentially, just whenever we cast a spell or instant, create a treasure token. Just another way to produce more additional treasures. We don't play, like I said, a lot of spells, so probably one of those things that we don't need a bunch of copies of. But he does get +1/+0 for each artifact we control, which we do have a few in our equipments and our vehicles. Other than that, I mean, the deck is pretty straightforward. I think I went up to 3 copies of Embercleave, added in the Goldspan Dragons. I think I changed the copies of 7 Doors to 7, 4 copies of Rimrock Knight. Overall, the deck is pretty fun. It kind of feels like a weird Dwarf tribal mono red deck with a splash of white just for a couple cards. I do think you probably play a version of this deck without any of the white spells in the deck, but I just figured we just have him there. because you know Cole is kind of like a dwarf, so I figured I include him, but we don't really have to. There's other dwarves that I think came in call time that I didn't include that you know could make a consideration. But I do like the one mechanic that this deck does have that if you're not familiar with is actually the crew ability. So the interesting thing you can do here that kind of gets around actually having to attack him with your dwarves, especially if your opponent has a very, you know, it has like blockers in the way, or if you don't really want to swing into your opponent just yet, is you can kind of crew any number of creatures, but as long as you know, you can crew them to actually, you know, make this a creature. But even if you get more, if you crew more than that, so if you tap, you know, 3 creatures that are dwarves, you get 3 treasure tokens because sure, you hit the 2 and this becomes a creature, but in the process you're tapping the dwarves down. It's whenever they become tapped, it's not when they attack. So it's actually one of those cool, interesting ways to get around having to attack in. And the other idea here is, if in case your opponent decides to actually kill this, if you make this a creature, you can only sacrifice two treasures and return this from our graveyard to our hand, so it just reoccurs itself. So it's definitely very interesting, and I do kind of enjoy that. 7 doors is also very good for the deck, just because it gets +1/+1 for each other dwarf named 7 doors we control. So that's also very good. You know, Magda's kind of like our dwarf lord because she gives all our doors +1/+0. Another way I was actually thinking of it, was I was actually thinking of maybe splash in the rune dwarf guy. That's mono. That's in the white side of it. But then I was like, I would have to cut some things I kind of like in the deck and play runes instead of certain things. So I kind of felt like I wanted to play this version, like a vehicle style version of the deck. But like I said, the deck overall plays very well. It plays kind of like I said, a Dwarven mono red. But I mean, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. I mean, this is definitely one of the ones that someone was asking me about, like, you know, where can I upgrade? And I just figured, like, you know, you kind of keep the deck the same and maybe just add in a couple more additional rares like Torbrand or copies of Embercleave. Goldspan Dragon definitely, because I mean, Goldspan Dragon is really good. Creates treasure tokens, which this deck is all about. Just overall a good value kind of style of deck, especially, you know, another tribal deck. With that being said, guys, I mean, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot here. All the descriptions for the decks will be down below in the description. And if you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next video.